Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today a signal has reached us from Lard Island and Rich is joining us to talk about Chain of Command 2nd edition. So it's great to have you with us here today, Rich.
It's great to be with you. Looking forward to having our chat and reaching out to everybody out there with all their questions that they've got in their minds. Hopefully we can answer some of them.
That's what we aim for, although my aim tends to be fair to middling at best, especially at this hour of the morning. Before we get into what version 2 looks like, I thought it would be helpful to give people a bit of an idea of what Chain of Command is, if they've not come across it before. Because at its heart, it's a platoon-based World War II game with some support. So it's not a game where you're going to see tons and tons of figures on the table and a mountain of armoured fighting vehicles and that sort of thing. But it's got a similar model count that you would see in other 28mm skirmish games. So do you want to tell us a bit about how it came to be, and there's sort of the key differences you see between Chain of Command and some of the other games that are out and about there on the market?
What we attempted to do with Chain of Command was, at the very outset, what I really wanted to do was to create a military simulation that people with a military background could play as a serious wargame. But I also wanted it to be fun. So rather than put in a load of turgid mechanisms that were, might look very accurate because of their complexity, I thought, I want to do it all with game mechanisms that are fun to play, so people can come to it who don't have any military background whatsoever and enjoy playing a game, but also enjoy the fact that it feels like what they read about in the history books. So the emphasis was trying to get something that felt plausible in terms of what you read about when you're reading accounts of those battles that we all think I'd really love to put that on the tabletop as a game. Because the great thing about World War II is there's 1,000,001 books on it, and every one of them is packed with scenario ideas for us wargamers. So I wanted to do something that was really fun to play, but had that approximation of the struggles and challenges of command. So one of the mechanisms that we have in there is the use of the command dice, which allows you to make lots of choices. So every time that you're active in a game, you've got decisions to make. And I think that's very, very much what you hear about from people who've led forces in action. It's all about making that constant procession of decisions. And I always felt with war games when I was a young man growing up, that they almost played themselves. You lined up your army, and it was obvious you were going to advance over there, and it was obvious you were going to reinforce the centre because you could see that's where your opponent was strong. And what I wanted to do was introduce some ideas from the concept of the empty battlefield, where you're faced with an empty battlefield, and where is the enemy? Well, you've got the information that your patrols have given you where they bumped into the enemy beforehand, but now you've got an empty battlefield ahead of you, and how are you going to achieve your objective? So it was trying to get sort of semi-realistic challenges into a game structure without the two conflicting with each other, making the two work symbiotically, which is a big word for this time in the morning.
Yeah, it's a great word. 100%. I appreciate it at this time of the morning. And I mean, the empty battlefield is the key. There's a few game systems out there that I've played that have a similar idea behind them. A lot of the Ancients games, mostly it has to be said, where you have a scouting phase and the patrol phase that begins the game that sort of sets up where the forces are going to be meeting. And a lot of people will see that as unique because potentially they've come from either sci-fi games or fantasy games, maybe things like Warhammer, where they've got into historical games from those, but they're very similar makeups in the game, in that you have a deployment phase and the scenario defines how far you deploy, what your objectives are going to be. But with the patrol phase and Chain of Command, you don't have any of that. You start tentatively feeling the area out in front of you. And obviously there's an objective that you're going to capture a gun or take crossroads or whatever it happens to be. But you don't have prior knowledge of where your opponent is deploying from. And likewise, they don't know where you're coming from either. So how long did it take for that to sort of come around when you were developing the game? Because it's very slick, and the idea of these patrol markers being locked down when they're giving you the jumping off points, which essentially becomes your deployment zone in the game. It's a fascinating addition. And it's almost like a mini game in itself to begin your scenario.
Yeah, I've played a lot of Kriegspiel on maps in my time, where basically the red team are in one room over there and the blue team in a room over there, and you've got an umpire in the middle, and the red team know where their forces are because they're on the map, and the other team know where their forces are because they've got their own map. But what they don't know at that point in time is where their opponent is. So the big start of any map Kriegspiel of the type the military use puts a lot of emphasis on putting patrols out, putting scouts out. If we're talking Napoleonics or Ancients, putting out your light cavalry to find where the enemy is. And one of the things you see in so many war games is that people chuck their light cavalry into a battle on the tabletop and get them all killed, and they don't really care. But for an army in the field, that light cavalry are their eyes and ears. And you see that a lot in those Kriegspiel type games. And I thought, well, what I really want to do is replicate that feeling in a tabletop game. But I didn't want it. And I've played some games where you play a pre-game game, and that then determines how many troops you've got or stuff like that, fairly random stuff. And you then get into the game, which is associated but quite different. I wanted the patrol phase to really be part and parcel of the main game. So as you rightly say, the patrol phase determines how much ground you can capture from your enemy before the game begins, and then where your troops can deploy to. So you're not lining them up on the table edge and then advancing towards the enemy, because that flags up to them exactly where you're going. Often it'll say, right, well, we know he's going for the crossroads on turn one because we can see where the forces are massing. But I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to give players the opportunity to try and capitalize on the terrain and actually look at the terrain, because a lot of us, we get our figures out of the box and we've got our head down and we put them on the edge of the table. And only then do we look up and go, right, what's happening? I wanted people to actually look at the terrain and go, what are the key points of ground here that I really want to either control or avoid or dominate with fire if I can't actually capture them? And so it gives people a shove in the right direction to say, look at the blooming table and think about how you're going to achieve it. Where are the covered avenues of approach? How are you going to get to your objective? And moving the patrol markers about, I honestly can't remember how we started doing that, because it's Chain of Command has been around sort of published for 13 years, and we were play testing it for a couple of years before that. But it was very much a case of I remember using poker chips in the very earliest playtest. So it hasn't really changed very much from the original version, because what we wanted was something that's quick and easy to play, and it doesn't become a second game. It's actually it's very much a starter before the main course. You're not having two main courses. So the mechanism didn't really change very much, but it does provide us. It links in intrinsically with the fact that you then generate your deployment points, your jump-off points. That's where you can get to on the table. They're individual points, but you can deploy within 6 inches of that. So it gives you a 12-inch diameter. So you're likely to end up with 3 dinner plates on the table, if you like, where you can deploy to. That then means your opponent knows roughly where you've been seen, but they don't know which ones you're going to deploy to. They don't know whether you're going to deploy on the right or the left or in the center, but they know roughly the area where you're coming from. So it creates the threat, but it doesn't give you all the information. So you're starting the battle with imperfect information. And when you get to a point where you've obliged your opponent to deploy all their forces on the table, but you've still got forces in reserve up your sleeve, that's when you've got a real advantage, because you can then deploy to get overwhelming firepower at a key point, or then deploy to avoid them completely and win the game by doing something else. So it was trying to get something that was meshed into the actual game itself.
One of the things I like about it is that anybody who's read any military history from World War II in particular will get the idea of the fluidity of the lines. You know where you are, and like you were saying, you know where your opponent is somewhere in front of you, theoretically. And behind you should be safe. And I remember reading a book by Wilhelm Tieck, who's a Dane, and it's about the Eastern Front, and during an assault on their positions on the Narva line, they heard a rumbling from behind them, and they thought that area theoretically is behind them and therefore safe. So everything's fine. We've been here for a while. We're dug in. So they didn't even turn around to look. And all of a sudden, out of the fog came a T-34, covered in tank riders, who'd got lost in the assault that was coming the other way, broke through the line somewhere else, had turned around and had come back through again. And it shows the mayhem, the fog that existed within the encounters. And yes, knowing that you've got theoretically friendly lines behind you, it obviously it sets things up when you're playing the mission in Chain of Command, and when you're setting this up to get people to take a look at how they're playing and take a look at the terrain and cover, because I do think that a lot of people see terrain as a feature. You know, there's a wall there, it's got a better cover save than a hedge that might be adjacent to it or close by it. So they don't look at the battlefield as a whole overarching point of view. And that really helps the patrol phase engage and give you more of an idea that you're recreating something that happened rather than a generic scenario for a game.
It's about establishing a mindset. Rather than saying to you, you've got to think about it like this, I'm telling you to do it, you're a very naughty boy if you don't. It actually encourages you to do that without me telling you. And a well-played patrol phase can give you advantages in the game. I don't think it can ever win you the game completely, but it can certainly give you a positional advantage. But it's what goes on from there in terms of the decisions you make that then decide how successful the patrol phase have been. Some people say, oh, well, you won it in the patrol phase. Well, the chances are they won it by what they did as a result of the patrol phase. So they created an excellent jumping off point and then took advantage of that. So, but yeah, it's an interesting part of the game, and we haven't changed it at all in version 2, working on the principle that if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, that's probably the best way to view any new edition of a game, because often when people see a new edition's coming, and even one that's been out for 13 odd years, the fear creeps in. Is this game going to change? Am I still going to enjoy it? Is my army list suddenly going to be invalidated, or am I going to be left with stuff on the shelf? And all these things sort of crop up. And then if people don't get the answers they want quickly enough, then they start to fictionalize things in their head. And, well, nobody's told me that this is happening, therefore the worst is happening. And it's always the worst. But you've kept version 2 relatively the same as version 1. It's not been broken down and built back up again from brass tacks. It's an evolution, I suppose.
Yeah, very evolutionary, certainly not revolutionary. I've got to take into account the fact it's probably my favourite game, as well as other people's. So I don't want to trash something that I enjoy. I don't want to destroy that and break it down. Really, the initial motivation for doing a second edition was, I've been publishing rule sets now for nearly 25 years. And when we published Chain of Command, I'd only been doing it for 10, 11 years. And of that, probably the first 6 were as a sort of hobby publishing, as well as having a real job. And I just got to the point a few years ago, before COVID actually, where I thought, I could do a much better job of writing this now. And at that point in time, I didn't think, I completely want to change things. I just thought it would be nice to present this in a more efficient fashion. And that was really because we were producing handbooks like the 1940 handbook for the Blitzkrieg in the West, and starting to work on the Far East handbook at that point in time, which we published last year, which obviously deals with the Far East, funnily enough. That does what it says on the tin. I thought, actually, there's some stuff in here that I would like to include in the main rules. But at that point in time, it was more about taking the rules, writing them better, and also introducing the ideas that we'd had from the handbooks. And then when I sat down, I thought, hold on a minute, Clarke, you better write a proper design brief here. Otherwise, you're just going to randomly go bumbling off into the woods, making random decisions. And I thought, well, actually, I have got an obligation to think, can we do it better in terms of making the rules better than they are? And I had some interesting talks about games mechanisms with Dave Brown, veteran game designer, author of General Dame and O Group and all sorts of bits and pieces that we publish with our sister company, Reiswitz Press. And he flagged up a couple of issues, and I thought, oh, he's right. I could respond and do something a bit better with that. So I really looked at trying to layer those improvements on top, rather a layer of icing on a cake. The cake's good, but we're going to make it better by putting the icing on top, rather than smashing the cake up with a hammer and rebuilding it. So it served a purpose in terms of getting it better written and more clear, but it's also allowed us the opportunity to revisit some of the core principles of the game and say, are we happy with that? Can we do that better? And I wanted to get something that was more interactive. Very much like when you play a video game with your mates and they're online and you're online, you're not waiting, you're not having your go while they sit there and have a cup of tea and wait for you. And equally, you then sit there and wait for them. You're all in there. It's all interactive and everything's happening at the same time. And I like the idea of taking the idea of a turn-based game, but trying to make it more interactive. So you've got less clarity in terms of where your turn begins and ends, and that I have got things to do and things to think about, because the game is all about thinking, making those key decisions. Do I want to intervene here? It's not my turn, but I can intervene if I want to. It's all about having those opportunities that really keeps you on the ball during play.
And a big part of that is obviously the chain of command dice themselves, being able to interrupt or end a phase, some of the actions that are ongoing, or exploit them in another way to your advantage. And I think I may be wrong on this, you can tell me, but you've expanded some of what you can do with the chain of command dice in the game, and with the national characteristics now to give more of an interesting decision for players, because you've got this finite resource there, and the idea of using them for turning a jumping off point, maybe progressing up the table off an AFE for the Soviets is a big one. But you can also go and look at some of the other ways to spend points now, and it's a different way to manage them. If all of a sudden you're thinking, would pushing a unit further up the table be worthwhile, or is it better to hang on for a turn or so and interrupt your opponent with your points instead, because they're so integral to the game, and if he may be sitting on an objective that you're about to push on to, then obviously that will be a key use of the chain of command point. So how has that been? Because the command system is integral, honestly. I mean, the game's named after it, but it was quite limited in what you could do with it beforehand. So obviously expanding these choices are very interesting.
Yeah, I think national characteristics are an important part of chain of command, because they're designed to reflect the way troops were trained to fight, and the different doctrines that each nationality had. So if you get a German unit that doesn't put a lot of emphasis on using its MG42, then you've probably got the rules wrong. That really is the backbone of every German squad, and the real hard hitting force within the platoon. So we wanted to reward the Germans when they used the doctrine of using their MG42. We wanted to reward the British when they when they relied on their doctrine of accurate and rapid firepower and the use of smoke to allow maneuver. We wanted to encourage the Soviets to act like Soviets in terms of aggressively pushing forward and being able to use their tanks in coordination with their infantry. You know, you talked about the situation in the Battle for Narva, where you've got those Soviets turning up and all of a sudden there's tank riders on the back of that tank. And you read it so many times, you know, that the Germans hear the grinding of the tank tracks coming towards them. And then suddenly there's a load of Soviet infantry swarming around them. So sometimes you have to use the abstract in order to recreate the realistic. So, you know, are those Soviets on the back of that tank, or are they advancing behind it, using it as cover? But the important thing is that they're using it, and that is at the crux of their advance. What we tried to do with the chain of command points, which are generated partially by the command dice, there are other ways that chain of command points are generated, is to allow you to do all the things that were there in the first edition. So interrupting a turn, so moving a jump-off point forward. If you've managed to advance your troops forward, you can push the jump-off point forward, representing the fact that you've really captured that ground and consolidated your position. That allows you then to jump troops off in a more forward position. You've got other options in there as well, such as ending a turn. But what we wanted to do was try and make the game a little more interactive, where you get opportunities. I call them react moves. I don't know why they're not called that, but I call them that. So you've got some options in there that if your opponent rushes across a field in front of you, you can respond to that by playing 3 chain of command points, which you've generated during play. And that just means that whilst the rules allow for units to be put on Overwatch, you can see that my unit on the hill is on Overwatch. And you might say, well, I'm not going to run across that field because he's on Overwatch, he's going to shoot me. This allows me to have a miniature form of Overwatch that if you take the mickey and do something, you know, really cheeky and ignore me and go, I'm running across that field, I can now respond to you doing that. But equally, you've got a response to that where you can hit the dirt. That allows you to go tactical, which is what we call it, which is where you're hugging the ground, you're taking advantage of the folds in the terrain, because wargames tables are flat as a pancake largely, whereas real ground, even my garden's not. I've been trying to get that flat for 30 years, and it still looks like a somme. But it's so real ground has got low points, high points that troops can take advantage of. So that's in there. You've also got an opportunity that it's almost like a crawl move. We call it reposition, really, which, you know, if you're hung out to dry, you can, even if you're pinned, you can roll a d6 and just get back behind that wall, get a bit of cover, or use it to creep forward before you launch an assault. So there's a bit of flexibility in there in terms of whether you're using just a few chain of command points or waiting for the big decisions that take the full chain of command dice of 6 points. So that's the mechanism we've used for allowing you to interact with my turns when I'm playing. It just allows you to respond to what's happening around you, as opposed to just sitting there and accepting the fact you're being bashed around the head for a couple of minutes until it's your turn. That's one of the real big changes, in that chain of command points for those who played the game are easier to accumulate, but also you've got more things to spend them on. So it's a bit like a sweet shop. You've just got more pennies to spend in the sweet shop, and who doesn't like that?
I mean, deep down, we all do. And you could really make something out of a 10p mix-up back when half pennies were still a thing. With some of the other changes then, the army lists are staying largely the same, just sort of slight tweaks here and there within the nations? Yeah,
largely the same, if only for the reason that I've probably got all those armies, and I don't want to have to repaint a load of stuff. And we base the orders of battle for these platoons on what was historically the case. with the odd tweak that you make for game playability. But it does mean that you have that consistency, that a British rifle platoon looks like a British rifle platoon, and a German, rifle squad looks like a German rifle squad. So there is that consistency. We have tweaked a couple of things. So, for example, in the first edition, because the British always get a Piat with their rifle platoon, we decided to give the Germans a Panzerschreck, even though historically they weren't part of the platoon. So this time we've said we shouldn't really have done that. That's ahistorical. We'll move them back to be a support option. But if you've got one painted and it was part of your platoon, you just can select it as a support option anyway. So it's you're not really losing out. You're not having to do anything. The British 2-inch mortar gets an extra crewman to represent the Lance Corporal who was with that, because we tended to ignore Lance Corporals in the first edition, but we're still ignoring them. They're not leaders, but they are there in terms of numbers. So very, very few changes. One of the things we've done with the Soviets is we've looked at the way they're structured to make them less of a club hammer and more of a fine fencing blade. So they're probably, I think we were a bit harsh on the Soviets in the first edition. But actually, by 1944 and 45, which is what we're covering in the main rule book, they were pretty good at their trade. So we've reflected that better. And we've got a few more selections in there that we didn't have before. So the Germans get Volks Grenadiers, who are really interesting. You get to use them in the Battle of the Bulge and all the later battles. And the Soviets have got a motor rifle platoon who you can or can't add lorries to if you want, because there's a lot more emphasis in the rules on using vehicles. In the first edition, we sort of went, they'd probably left them off the table, but it was a bit of a fudge. It became apparent that it was a bit too much of a fudge. And I thought, well, we really want to get them in there, and we really want to get them activating and being an exciting part of the game. So one of the things you can do with 3 chain of command points is do an assault deployment where you chuck your SDKFZ 25 whatever down the road and then jump out with your troops, go on Overwatch ready to fire, or go tactical or open fire or assault if you're crazy, because that's a bit risky. They're much better being used as taxis than battering rams. But yeah, so lots of small changes in there that we think make it more dynamic.
Yeah, and some of that is obviously coming from the fact that you've had 13 years of essentially the broadest playtesting you can get. When it's been released into the wild, which is a fantastic way of doing it. They say that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and the same is true for rule sets, that once wargamers have got their hands on it and have found something, even a little thing like flamethrowers and engineer squads, it's like, well, all of a sudden they've become an auto-include, and it gives you a good chance to sort of weed those sort of things out as well.
Yeah, we certainly found that with the first edition. You went, okay, well, flamethrowers are okay, but people aren't going to use them that much. But all of a sudden, it was like bonfire night in some cases. Flames are going off everywhere, and you think, well, we've got to limit that. So you can only choose flamethrowers now for the 2 scenarios out of the 6 where you are attacking a known objective position, because that's when you bring your flamethrowers forward to take on defined and definite objectives. They wouldn't be milling around waiting for people to say, come and give us a hand over here, mate. It didn't work like that.
Yeah, they just become tanks of fuel running around the battlefield, willy-nilly, tethering you on until they're in your way, and then they explode.
Exactly.
Funnily enough, I do want to talk to you about the scenarios, because that's quite a change as well for version 2, from what I can see. And there's a greater emphasis is going back onto victory by the scenario conditions.
The scenarios had the same names as version 1. The idea was that it went through 6 phases of battle. So you have the initial patrol, where you get 2 patrols bumping into each other. You then get the probe, which is where one side has driven off the opponent's patrols and they are probing against their their forward defensive line. You get the next game where you get an attack on an objective, which is where they've broken through the forward defensive line and they're now into the first line positions. And you then get 2 battles of exploitation where they've broken through after the first objective, and they're heading for the final battle, which is the attack on the ultimate objective. So I wanted to keep that structure because that's important, because you can actually play that as a campaign. Just playing those games together, it tells you a story, and it's all storytelling is very important to me in my game, and the fact that the narrative that comes out of them is plausible and fun and believable, and this, that, and the other. So what we have done, though, is we put a lot more emphasis on objectives in the scenario, because we found with experience that one of the ways to win the game the primary way to win the game in version 1 is to destroy your enemy's force morale. Well, that's not historically incorrect. And when you go into any battle, what you're looking to do is to persuade your opponent that that's not somewhere they want to be, and they should really go away to somewhere else. You don't have to kill them all or see them all routing from the field. They should come to that logical point that we ain't going to win here, so let's go. But that did get to the point where you'd say, right, we're playing a scenario here, which is an attack on the objective. Your objective is to take that church. And the player would go, I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to line up over here and shoot them all. And then when their force morale is collapsed, then I'll take the church. And you think, right, well, that's not what we intended. So, as you rightly say, after only another 13 years of playtesting, we thought, right, we're going to address this. We're going to introduce some mechanisms to encourage the players to actually stick to their mission briefing, and the objective becomes much, much more important. But what I didn't want to do is create a situation where you have an objective marker on the table, and one medic on a unicycle zooms up the road and jumps off and stands on it and says, I've won the game. So we've created a mechanism called the final countdown, which is a very silly name. But I don't care. I like silly names. And which means that once your medic cycles up the road on his unicycle and jumps off and says, I've won, that then triggers a countdown to the end of the game, but you don't know how long it is. It's a bit like the clock going red in a rugby match, and you don't know how many phases of play there are going to be before the match ends. And that was actually the inspiration from it. I'm a big rugby fan, and it kind of I want that tension that comes after the 80 minutes, and one side is really driving hard to get the result that they want, and the other side is really driving hard to stop them. And the game really becomes hyper at that point in time. And that's what I wanted in Chain of Command. And we called it that.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic way of doing it as well, because when people know they've a fixed limit, whether it's a time limit for the amount of turns they're playing or objective points scored or victories, whatever it happens to be, it tends to focus the mind on that. And like you say, that break between that idea of killing your opponent off entirely and then picking up whatever you need to pick up, whether it's orders from a down glider or just run everybody off a gun and do everything at your leisure. It's never going to happen in reality. If an officer is told to go and do something, then what they don't say is, let's stand at the side of the field, lads, and just keep shooting the enemy until they leave, and then we'll achieve the command that we've been set. They went and did it, and it's an intriguing way of getting people to play like they should be playing, like the scenario dictates they should be playing. Their orders are telling them, go and follow the chain of command, follow the objective that's been set out by your superior. And for goodness sakes, people, it's the name of the game, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a subaltern sat there with your platoon doing what you described, somebody senior to you, a captain or a major, is going to come along and you're going to get a size 9 boot somewhere that tells you should be moving. So we've created a size 9 boot in the form of a metaphorical size 9 boot, of course. You don't get one with the game. In the form of these objectives which say to you, get a move on or you're going to lose. And we've got another mechanism in there called the ticking clock, where the defender in some scenarios can say, right, I'm going to play a chain of command dice and reduce your force morale by 1, because it's just to needle you to get a move on, because that pressure is potentially there.
Yeah, and it stops people who are sitting in a solid defensive position becoming a bit blasé all of a sudden, if they've got something that just starts to chip away at them as well, and forces them into action.
Well, we've given people a lot more tools in terms of the ability to use fire and manoeuvre. So you can crawl forward, you can run knowing that you can then hit the dirt when the enemy opens fire. So the opportunities that you can interrupt, the opportunities are all in there. It's just how you use them and when you use them. Some people we've found like playing the short game, so when they get 3 points on their chain of command dice, they'll very rapidly burn that, getting little advantages. Some people might hang on to get the big advantages that the full chain of command dice gets them. It's getting that balance. It's realizing it is resource management. Of course it is. That's what the game is about. But the resource you've got is that command initiative, the number of orders you've got. So we're trying to replicate some of the decision-making process that a commander would really have to make on the ground, but do it in a fun way, in a game mechanism.
Well, that sounds absolutely fantastic then. So when can people expect to see version 2 of Chain of Command?
Well, funny you should ask that, mate. As we speak, the printer will have it with him today. And we need to wait for the printer's proof to come back, which will be 2 or 3 days. So we are going ahead and launching we've set the publication date. I can't remember. Let me look on the wall. We've set the publication date for Wednesday, the 28th of May. But people who are going to Partisan in Newark will be able to get a mega Partisan bumper, exciting, don't pay the postage bundle, whatever we call it. So you'll be able to order in advance and pick up on Sunday the 18th from Newark if you were there, because the way postage is, saving £5 on an envelope is worth doing. So that'll be sort of an early orders there, but people will be able to start putting in their advanced orders Monday the 6th or 7th. I can't remember what day it is, but very soon indeed.
All right then. So on or just after the May Bank holiday weekend, I suppose.
It is the May Bank holiday weekend. You're absolutely. Whether we get it up for the Bank holiday Monday or whether we do it on the Tuesday depends on how keen the website company are to work on bank holidays. But yeah, I'm hoping it'll be Bank holiday Monday. So yeah, but we'll see. But that's there or thereabouts, which is good enough, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's very close for people who are looking forward to it. So what are the plans then for version 2 going forward? Obviously, you have a ton of pint-sized campaigns, which are little one-shot sort of scenarios or mini campaigns on the website that people can pick up for the price of a pint. And then there's also the handbooks as well. Now, you were saying that version 2 takes some of its notes from the mechanics within the Far East handbook. So I'm assuming that all of the wealth of publications you currently have on the website are still completely compatible with second edition.
Yeah, even when we started writing the 1940 handbook, we thought, this is going to be the pattern for the future. So those handbooks are version 2 compliant, for want of a better phrase. So we're not going to be going back and changing those. In the pipeline, we've got the Arnhem handbook, which has been waiting in the wings, but we had to put that on the back burner because we were going to get version 2 of the rules out. But that now, the log jam is broken there. And we've got the Pacific handbook, which covers the US and Australian forces predominantly, and Japanese, obviously, but the US and Australian campaigns in the Pacific that we're going to be wheeling out after that. There are 7 pint-sized campaigns attached to Operation Market Garden, which we've got to bring out, which we've got them all written. So you could spend the rest of your life gaming Operation, well, my life anyway, at my age, gaming Market Garden, should I so wish. And it feels like I've been doing that for the last 10 years anyway, but yeah. But yeah, there's loads of stuff. I'm very keen to do some 1945 end of the party type pint-sized campaigns, because I've been doing a lot of reading on that, and it's quite gritty, and but it's always interesting, always tactically interesting, and you've got two quite different forces opposing each other. It's not exactly asymmetrical because it's still conventional warfare, but it has a real asymmetrical nature to it. It was very much the same, well, similar to you get with the Japanese fighting the Westernized armies in the Far East and Pacific. You're not comparing apples with apples. It's very definitely apples and oranges, and that's quite. I like that. It adds a certain frisson.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if you're a commander on the ground that's having to deal with somebody who's sitting on a potential technological advantage over your forces, how you deal with that and mitigate their advantages is part and parcel of the game itself. It's just a challenge to be overcome. Yeah,
that and those challenges, I think are interesting. I mean, one of the things that we never do is we've never run sort of competition games. We've never done competition type events with equal sized forces and this, that, and the other. But yes, obviously there is a point system in there, and it allows you to balance your forces however you want to do that. But I've always seen, that the game is all about challenges rather than about fairness, because fairness can be a bit bland, can't it? I was at a competition. I was in a game store recently, and they were laying out the terrain to be completely symmetrical for both sides in some game they were playing with sort of space people. And I just thought, I don't really fancy that. That's not for me. I'm more interested in variety being the spice of life.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to leave it there. If anybody has any questions for Rich, please drop them below and we'll send them over to Lard Island and see if we can get you an answer. Hopefully people will check out the videos we have on Chain of Command on the channel already if you've not seen it. Version 2 is not going to be that different, so it will give you a good grounding of how the game plays out. And it's a really interesting and engaging way to tackle World War II on the tabletop, and version 2 definitely sounds like it's going to be worth a look. So thank you, Rich, for your time.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.